Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are in what parts of the world. We welcome you to this special webinar in collaboration with World Bank. This is one of a series of webinars that have been arranged and conducted by Education and Training Evaluation Commission in Saudi Arabia in collaboration with the World Bank at different aspects of education, whether K to 12, higher education, post-secondary or tertiary education. We are truly privileged today to have a leader in tertiary education, post-secondary education, Dr. Roberta Mali Bassett. She is the global lead for tertiary education and senior education specialist at the World Bank. She has a very impressive resume. I will try to summarize the resume, not to take time of your valuable presentation that I have looked at, and it was very impressive. She provides leadership and technical expertise for projects related to post-secondary education around the world. Most recently, she's been working in East and Southern Africa, as well as the new EU member states and Russian Federation. She has been team lead for a variety of tertiary and higher education projects in topics such as finance, quality assurance reform, internationalization of higher education, equity and access, skills development, as well as she sits on the editorial board of many journals, as well as the advisory board on the International Network of Higher Education in Africa, and the editorial board of Higher Education Quarterly. She has taken multiple academic leadership position as the assistant dean and director of the summer session at Stanford University for 5 years. She's been the manager and editor of the Review of Higher Education and Education Policy. She's the author in numerous publications. Lastly, Roberta has received her PhD from the Center of International Higher Education at Boston College, a Master of Arts from Stanford University, and a Bachelor of Arts from Columbia University. We are truly privileged, Roberta, to have you with this vast experience and diverse exposure to different parts of the world, and with the content that I've seen in this presentation, I will be learning a lot, and my colleagues, attendees, we have more than 100 now, and climbing. The number is really climbing very fast. So we will have time. The first half of the presentation will be for the presentation. Then we will take questions from the attendees. Hopefully, they will write their questions in the chat box or in the QA box, so that we will have time, and I will be reading the questions to save time, to give the opportunity for lots of people to be to share their questions and inquiries. With that, without further ado, once again, we're privileged to have you, and we're looking forward for a very informative and educational for us attending at ETIC, as well as all our colleagues and interested people who joined us in this webinar. Thanks again for accepting the invitation, Roberta, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sohail. I will introduce the presentation just a little bit before I share the screen entirely. And I want to thank all of you for joining today and taking the time out of your busy schedules to learn a bit about what we have been doing at the World Bank, both as strategy development around tertiary education quite broadly, and also in response to COVID. As has been experienced by everybody around the world. We were on track to deliver what we thought was going to be a new strategy, or at least a new direction for tertiary education interventions, right as the COVID crisis hit. And so this presentation is actually a bit of an adaptation of what we had initially thought we would be doing. And some of that will stay in place, this focus on tertiary education systems, which I will talk about in a minute. But a lot of this actually is going to require new thinking, and we are embracing that and using it as an opportunity to be innovative and responsive to our clients' needs in light of what we see coming, both in terms of the educational impacts and also the fiscal constraints that will be impacting how higher education is funded and directed in the future. So with that, I will do my presentation. It should take about 30 to 35 minutes. I do talk very fast because I'm from the East Coast of the United States. So Dr. Sohail, especially, if I'm going too fast, please interrupt me and ask me to slow down. As I really get into this topic, it's a topic, obviously, I've spent my whole career focusing on. I can get very excited, but it also means I can talk very fast. So it doesn't bother me at all to slow me down, because I know the audience will be second and third language English speakers, and I am in awe of all of your linguistic capacities because I don't share them. So don't hesitate to slow me down. Okay.
Sure.
Okay. So I'm presenting from my laptop. So Dr. Sohail, you'll be able to see me still speaking, but I will be turned away from you as I look at my computer. So again, as I said, we had been looking to see and think about how we could reposition tertiary education in the latter 2/3 of the 20th century, really 3/4, because it's changing. We've been sort of examining the same core issues for a very long time. We've been looking at finance, quality assurance, and governance as the three big pillars of tertiary education reforms and structures. But what should be different? What can be different in the 21st century? This is where our thinking was as COVID hit. So I will introduce some just key underlying foundational concepts at the beginning, and then I will pivot to the COVID conversation towards the end. So here at the beginning part, we talk about what is tertiary education. For us, it is all types of formal education that comes after completion of a post-secondary degree. And for many students, the secondary education may or may not have been for a theoretical degree. It could be for a technical vocational degree. For us, it doesn't really matter. It really is just about the formal delivery of education after the secondary requirements have been completed. So that would be inclusive of universities, but also further colleges, community colleges, technical vocational education that comes after secondary education. And we look at tertiary education as an important investment. And as many of you know from the World Bank's work, this has been an evolving position. In the 60s and 70s, when the research was showing returns on investments that were stronger for primary and secondary, the advice given to countries around the world, not incorrectly necessarily, but perhaps missing some clear opportunities, was to focus on primary education most significantly. And that was where the investments were in the 80s and in the 90s. In the 1990s, the World Bank started really pivoting a bit to say, actually, tertiary education is vitally important. And it is for these reasons, because tertiary education is important for fostering long-term growth and boosting shared prosperity, which is one of the two twin pillars of the World Bank's mission. It works to make graduates and workers more employable, with higher wages and higher service industries being served by this educated population. And it allows for easier adaptation to economic shocks. And this is something that the COVID crisis has exposed very strongly. It currently, with the new modern research that takes public and private into account, it has the highest return of investment. And that actually is even more the case in lower and lower income countries, for reasons that economists would completely understand, having to do with supply and demand. And we also note wider individual and societal benefits, including health outcomes, political participation, civic participation, communal connectivity, and likewise. So, the more educated an individual becomes through tertiary education, the more stable the societies are based around those better educated peoples. So where does the current environment stand in tertiary education? We do see some conflicts, some starker and more oppositional, some that are just sort of on a continuum. the world is becoming more globalized and multicultural, but we're also seeing stronger populist movements, nationalist movements, and that actually is changing some of this agenda, especially around in higher education, tertiary education, the internationalization agenda. And that's something we can go back to in the question and answers if people would like to talk more about internationalization. The global efforts in education and health and social protection have moved millions of people out of poverty, but the inequalities actually have been expanding, and the persistent ones keep in place. COVID is actually exposing some inequalities and inequities in education, and we'll talk about those in a minute. There's a demand for advanced skills, and this is great, but the cost has come in the diminishment of lower skilled work, manufacturing, agriculture, and that has real societal impacts. And so those conflicts are really notable. Technical skills remain in very high demand, but also something we're focusing on more and more are transferable skills, generic skills, soft skills, as we call them in a lot of contexts. And last, there's a rapid expansion of tertiary education. We've seen global enrollments increasing quite dramatically, although differently based on the regions, but there is still a strong lack of equity in access and in retention. And this actually just maps out to, the highest quintile of students are taking up those increased number of spaces, but there's still a lot of work to be done among lower quintile students in terms of socioeconomic status and also underrepresented groups. I'm sorry, it's not moving. Give me 1 second, please. Let me see. Okay, here we go. Okay, good. So how are we shaping tertiary education in the 21st century? This is some of just the pillars of our thinking on where tertiary education should be centered. Ensuring stable foundations. This includes resilient foundations around skills development, technical development, socioeconomic skills. So how do we ensure that every student has a robust and solid foundation of learning? We're focusing on equity. One of the other things that we've been talking about with our clients is this big demographic shifts that are happening around the world. In higher income countries, those are quite shocking diminishments of their population size and the shrinking of the cohorts entering tertiary education. In other parts of the world, South Asia and Africa, sub-Saharan Africa in particular, this is a massive expansion in the tertiary education population. So the advice will differ, but the shocks will be notable regardless of whether it's a decrease or an increase in population. And we wish to help our client countries be prepared for this. Another area that we're thinking about more and more is the private sector, and this includes both private providers of higher education, but also labor market interventions and partnerships. And how do we consider both spheres of private influence in tertiary education as we think about tertiary education policy? And the last, and none of this is going to be new or unexpected, is this focus on STEM, but we're also talking about STEAM, in which we add the arts and humanities, some more critical thinking spaces, so that it isn't just about science, technology, and math, but also about these soft skills that are very strongly imparted through arts or humanities and things that require critical thinking and strong writing as well, which employers are finding increasingly lacking in tertiary education graduates as the pivot has been towards STEM studies. So this model is actually sort of depicting what a stable foundation for tertiary education would look like. And at the top is a vision that your country, your structure would have a or in. And at the bottom is the data, so that the data, I don't know if you can see. I'm not sure you can see me anymore. So these are the top and bottom of the structure. Within that space, as I said before, is governance, quality assurance, and financing. These three work together very strongly and interact with each other. By governance, we mean both at the institutional level, who runs the institution, who provides the institution's vision and leadership, quality assurance. Also,
Roberta, I think we have issues with the voice connection.
now,
Roberta? Sorry, Roberta. Sorry for interruption. I think we have issues with the voice connection. We can't hear your voice clearly.
okay, yours is getting choppy now too. I'm going to see if I can.
Okay, I'll turn off my video.
Is it okay right now?
Yeah, your voice is clear. Okay, your voice is clear now. It's clearer than before.
Okay, I'm going to keep going, and you tell me if it's a problem, even if it's just by raising a hand or something, okay? Okay, and so on either side are the steering of the system, that there's a regulatory framework, that there are legislative environments in place, that there are steering committees or likewise individuals that provide structure and direction. And then on the right-hand side is this focus on outcomes. And it's something that we've been talking with our clients about quite extensively, that it isn't just about putting more students in school, putting more students in tertiary education. It's about the outcomes for those students. Do they finish school? Are they majoring in topics that are of value to them and will lead to productive outcomes for the individual and for society? Equitable access, retention, and success. These are very important elements to the steering of a foundation or establishment of a stable foundation for tertiary structure. And so we are discussing more and more. Okay, thank you. We're discussing more and more diversified and articulated systems. And this is something that emerged in the 60s from the California Master Plan. For anybody who's online, who's a higher education sort of scholar and has studied these things, but it is about having fully diversified and articulated systems. It allows for multiple forms of tertiary education. It isn't just a university. It can be anything from a certification program in a specific TVET field all the way up to your most world-class research universities. And by articulation, we mean that maybe a student is prepared only for a community college because their development has just been such that they hadn't achieved what needed to be achieved to go to a world-class university. But through their studies, maybe they do some short-term training, maybe they do community college course. If they prove that they can manage the workload, they can come into the sector at any point. Maybe they transfer to a state institution. Maybe they transfer later to a world-class institution. Maybe somebody who enters a community college gets a PhD down the road. What you want to have is a system that allows for that allows for each individual to find their pathway and that suits their skill set and their directional goals and the outcomes they're seeking. And if the system is robust enough, you can enter and exit that at any point based on your own personal drive. The system as a whole benefits strongly from this because it allows for not just lifelong learning as we know it, which is very skills related to work, but also an individual seeking career changes and shifts. If any of you have sat through any of the presentations by Jamil Salmi in the last 10 years or so, he talks a lot about the fact that most individuals entering the workplace within the last 10 years will have 4 or 5 distinct careers before they retire. That does require reskilling and a readaptation to what they're seeking from their work lives, and a well-developed articulated system allows for that. We focus within the World Bank. I hope we have dynamic conversations about this with our clients to focus on making equity a priority. A lot of this is not just about being fair, which of course we care about, but not everyone cares about fairness as much as we do. But it also is economically important as well, because talent can be lost when equity is not made a priority. There are a lot of people who have immense amounts of talents who are buckled by the system. The system doesn't allow proper preparation at different stages, or it's because of their gender, or it's because they are poor and need to work early. Equity allows for talent management in a way that's extremely important as societies evolve. And so it is for all stages of life that students and employers can ensure that they have individuals who at any point are able to achieve as they are capable in a system that cares about that and is seeking to help them do that. It is about flexibility in the system. It's about ensuring that they can study not just with the institution of their choice, but the field of their choice. This is what we call vertical and horizontal equity. Vertical equity is just being able to keep moving up the pipeline. Horizontal equity is about choosing what to study. Many of you may already know this, but based on income levels, gender, a rural or urban environment, just familiarity with employment outcomes, the field of study actually differs quite dramatically and has huge equitable impacts. Those who know to study economics and finance may know that that can lead to careers in banking and venture capital in ways that somebody else may not. And it's very exclusionary to not have access to whatever field of study is of interest and can lead to the outcomes you're seeking. So we look at equity in both directions. We're talking more and more about technology. This is something all of you are going to be extremely familiar with, but why are we looking at technology? It isn't just for the sake of technology. I hope some of you will ask questions about this because this has been a key conversation in the COVID era about, what is the purpose of technology now? Some of it, I hope it is about improving access and options. We will see more and more blended learning. I think that train has left the station. It'll be very unlikely for most institutions to ever go back to being completely in class. And I think that's an adaptation that's fantastic. Online delivery in its entirety, though, may also come with some very painful separation challenges, and that's something we can talk about. So it's not just a benefit here. Relevance is really important. How do we use technology for experiential and service training? You'll see here we offer some thoughts about virtual reality and artificial intelligence. This is a key question right now in the remote delivery of practical learning, medical schools, dental schools. How can there be continued education through remote delivery of what is normally a very hands-on field? Technology is allowing for modular and easier transition pathways between courses and institutions. Blockchain is helping with this. Micro degrees, like many of you may have seen this research on degree stacking or credential stacking, where you take courses from a bunch of different institutions and then it gets centered in some form by an agency into a degree program. This is all very new and is provided only by having the technology to support it. And efficiencies. I mean, everything with technology is supposed to be about efficiencies. The conversations happening today around this blended learning or complete online learning in the near future is how efficient is it in terms of cost per student, cost of delivery, but in terms of students finding their pathways, it can be extremely efficient. That allows students to seek the courses that are of specific interest to them. They can do it from anywhere. Technology can really support efficient learning and help students who have difficulty completing traditional degrees do this through other modes of delivery. And this is just how we've been articulating the benefits to society, both individual and society benefits from higher education graduates in terms of employability, wages, civic participation, and just general well-being outcomes. People with tertiary education on surveys are happier. These are things that they are less likely to get divorced. Just sort of life moments that can lead to happiness are calculated as being part of the benefits of having tertiary education. Society, human capital, a big conversation that the World Bank has been driving. Having a better educated society leads to stronger human capital and long-term growth for countries. It can be the driver for innovation and regional development. This is particularly of interest in the Middle East and North Africa, but also in all of our client contexts. And social cohesion and the well-functioning societies. This is a huge social benefit and something that today is extremely important. So this is the COVID context. So I'm pivoting now to the specific COVID conversation. I've seen many of your questions coming up. We'll go back to them when the presentation is over. And I'm talking more slowly than usual, but I'll try to get through this next batch so we can have a good conversation. At the peak of the COVID institutional closures, and I say this, that the physical plants of institutions closed. In most countries, delivery continued. So it isn't that education ended. In some places, it actually did, and for lots of important reasons. But in this case, about 220 million students around the world were impacted by the COVID crisis. And we will share these slides. I won't read through them, but there were differentiated impacts around the world, and it rolled around the world. So it hit China first, obviously, then it went to Europe, and the European institutions closed very quickly. North America was slower to adapt. The countries I work in sub-Saharan Africa, they closed around the same time as North America, but some of them have begun to reopen. And so this has been a very fluid process of how the physical plants have opened and closed. But in all cases, when the physical plant closed, the students were forced to start figuring out how to study remotely. And some countries did that better than others. And it wasn't even countrywide. It was institution by institution. So some of the actions that we have been discussing, I'm sorry, this is a little difficult to read. For leaders, we have a big global reaction note that went out online on the World Bank's website in April, and it was very close. We tried to get something out very quickly for institutional leaders to start thinking about as they close their institutions and how to develop short-term, medium, and long-term plans. In the short term, which we don't really need to discuss anymore, but it was about communication. How, once the institutions are closed, how do you keep communication open with your students and your academic staff? It was about leveraging the most widely used technology platforms, because in most cases, institutions didn't have enough of a robust delivery for online capability, right? So there were some courses, some blended learning existed, but for the most part, there was no 100% delivery online for most institutions. So this was something, what could you leverage? Coursera, edX, a bunch of the big MOOCs came in and offered free support for institutions to start pivoting. But for many countries, this is not possible because of the lack of internet penetration, which varies from between less than 30% in sub-Saharan Africa to about 95% in North America. I mean, that's a huge expanse of internet penetration, which does impact student equity. Another advisory point, which actually has become even more important, is this one-stop shopping space for people to get information about their institutions. There's a lot of confusion. It remains in place to this day about what institutions are doing today and tomorrow and next month. And there should be a single source of information where people can come, all stakeholders, to find out what the institution is doing and what the plans are. There's focus on curating open content. For many institutions, using existing content had to be immediately for provision of online delivery, simply because they just weren't prepared to deliver their own curriculum online, and guidance and support to students and teachers. So this is the span of challenges that we envisioned. Obviously, you all have lived through this, the institutional disruption, staff and student illnesses. This issue still is expanding and is something that's underpinning next step policy discussions. Student displacements for those who were living on campus, or even more so for international students, what was happening to them. Other issues like student loan maintenance, what to do about student loans, what to do about student fellowships. These students rely on these monies, and they weren't teaching and providing teaching fellowships or research work for their faculty anymore. How to keep paying those, or whether to keep paying those, was a big issue for our clients. Maintaining the instructional operations, obviously. Staff and faculty furloughs are an issue that are differing around the world based on the financial hits caused by the lack of tuition payments coming to students into institutions. So for many institutions, they actually had to lay off teaching and administrative staff, and this is something that's going to be very difficult for them to recover from. International mobility, this outdated technology platforms I put on here because obviously most institutions hadn't prepared for this. And I'm talking about institutions like MIT and Harvard, and some of the most prepared institutions in the world found their learning management systems insufficient at the time of the closures and had to rapidly. So it isn't just institutions in low-income countries, it's all institutions who hadn't anticipated this. This question about research operations, I don't know what that is. You know, in large research universities, I don't know what happened. There were severe problems with ongoing long-term research projects, what to do with samples, what to do with lab animals, how do you manage human subjects in a time of closures. All of these problems were unanticipated and caused massive, expensive, and also humanitarian problems for research institutions. And as I said before, there were significant equity. Something happened to my presentation. Okay. Okay. So this we don't need, I already talked about this. Here is some that we provided for institutions and governments on enabling distance education and online learning. On National Research and Education Networks, NRENs. Some of you may be very familiar with this concept. Others who are more about education, maybe less about technology, may find this new. But this is something that we're supporting more strongly in this COVID era, this need to have a triangulation between technology, technological providers, governments, and institutions. And NRENs provide that facilitation element. They serve as mediators between the institutions and the digital education marketplace. They offer services supporting learning management systems, digital libraries, access to free and low-cost resources. They are connected globally, so the NREN networks across continents and across countries is incredibly important, and it allows for very robust and rapid development of capacity at the local level because of this connectivity. They sustain local communities of experts, and this is something that's becoming more important in this COVID period. And they have led to the development of international standards. And so there's a robustness and a strength to these networks that allows confidence that what they're doing is going to have long-term viability for their countries. Here are some technology bottlenecks that we have anticipated. Inequality and connectivity, this I mentioned before, with the lack of internet penetration, students who don't have enough connectivity are at a loss. Faculty as well, although they've already achieved something in their status in their countries, that the impacts may be less painful, at least in the short term. But equity has been a massive problem. And urban students, for low and high income students, and for depending on geographic location of the country in question. There has been, you know, it's been made quite stark that academic staff's ability to deliver in remote is something that requires rapid skill development. And we'll see now in the summer, institutions around the world are doing boot camps for their faculty because they just coped in the closing period. Now they actually need to prepare and train and up the skill level of their academic staff. The students' capacity to adapt can be mixed. Some students are very comfortable with technology, others are not. And so how students adapt to online learning, it's a very challenging area, and institutions may or may not have the capacity to coach around those questions. This need to be comfortable with making mistakes. In many countries, this is a huge problem, and you know, being open about the mistakes that are going to be made and knowing that there's going to have to be a constant correcting. In some places, this is accepted and widely acknowledged and quite comfortable, and others it's quite painful. And so opening up that conversation about making mistakes, being comfortable with that, and being comfortable with adaptation. And then the last question is regulation. In many countries, delivery from foreign providers or online delivery is not recognized for credits or credentialing, and this can be a big problem, especially if this continues more than 3, 6, 12 months. And it looks like it's for many countries a long problem. I'm getting to my last couple slides. So we've articulated in just sort of a structure here that makes it easy to follow some key areas where the impacts for the medium and long term are going to hit. We will expect in terms of funding and quality, reduced public and private funding for tertiary education. the fiscal contraction, the global depression that we expect in the economies around the world will hit higher education. Higher education always gets reduced funding when budgets shrink. And so that's going to be a big problem. The private funding is how much can the individual pay for their own education, and especially for many countries, how much will foreign students be able to bring to support your system? Right now, many countries rely on international students for the funding that they provide their whole sectors, and that's going to be a big shock to many countries.
There's issue with the voice.
Yeah. Broad concerns over capacity.
The voice. Sorry, I can't hear you. There is issue with the voice clarity. The voice is interrupted.
The voice is talking. No. It looks okay to me, so I'm sorry.
It's very quiet. The voice is fluctuating.
Okay. Let me see. I'll try playing this. Maybe it's battery. Okay, we'll see. Around the world, we expect to see permanent closures of programs. Okay, programs and institutions. This is not just the loss of the programs themselves, the institutions themselves, but also the instructors and the administrators and people who have strong capacity to deliver tertiary education. They may choose to go into other sectors, they may leave the sector as a whole, but there will be a loss of talent here. And then also this movement of programs to online and remote platforms. And this requires supporting institutions, the technology, and the faculty training to deliver. We already know that PhD students are not necessarily trained particularly well to teach even one-on-one face-to-face learning.
Sorry, Roberta, we can't hear you. So just wait for a couple of minutes for Roberta probably to reconnect. If you can just wait with us for a couple of minutes, I think Roberta is reconnecting. Okay? Yeah, that's good.
Okay, it dropped me. I'm trying again. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sohail. Thank you very much. It helps to know when it's not working very well. Mm-hmm. Okay, so issues of loss to the community, inequity, and also this last point, which I'll bring up because it's not coming up very much in other forms, is the socio-emotional impacts on students and academic staff to remote teaching and learning. A lot of students and instructors require or depend upon these institutions to support their livelihoods. They are the place where they find their community. They're the place that they consider home. And so the challenges of going to remote learning, the isolation, the inability to have one-on-one instructions, or even the casual informal learning, the loss of that will have an impact on students and academic staff. And that's something institutions should plan for and prepare for. And we've seen institutional responses to this, including virtual happy hours and virtual office hours and sort of informal interactions through formal media. I'm not sure this is working. Okay, lastly, I can't tell if you can still hear me because it's spinning.
It's very clear. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Okay,
yes.
super. Okay. This is a very dense slide. I won't read through it, but these are large, long-term system level considerations for government. Some of it is a summation of the, or adds more detail to the previous slide. Some of it is new. Governments need to think about a diversification of funding sources, what to do about student loan schemes, examining more and more no-cost educational resources, strategic allocation of incentive funding. So this is where there is incentive funding, performance-based or other forms of strategic funding, how to apply that to institutions to promote better delivery in this remote environment, remote delivery, online platforms, or some other innovation around this new mode of delivery. I think we are only scratching the surface of how institutions or systems can adapt in this environment. Maybe there's going to be some brilliant thinking that comes completely out of left field. There should be some funds to support that. As I noted before, we expect institutional closures and mergers. This is going to happen not just in the most tuition-driven large systems like the US or UK. It's going to happen around the world. We've seen it already in Latin America and the Caribbean, for instance. We anticipate large graduate unemployment levels because of fiscal constraints and the likely economic contraction that's coming. The provision of increased capacity to building, this revision of bureaucratic barriers, that is about quality assurance, accreditation, about recognition of foreign credits, things like that. That's something that's going to have to be re-examined. This question of internationalization, I know it's one that the Saudi government has been thinking quite a lot about. How do you promote domestic-based internationalization? It's a fascinating conversation. We're having it with clients all over the world. How are we able to continue an international mindset in instruction and cooperation from remote delivery or from domestic environments where students aren't traveling abroad as much? How do we support at-risk students? And then the last is providing stronger risk assessments, having a longer-term vision about the sustainability of your institutions and your systems. And then I close with just an important quote, because we feel very strongly that as we are adapting with money and with sort of strong technocratic interventions to this process, it is important to understand the foundations of tertiary education and why we care about it and what it does for society. And I'll just sum this last point, which is that we do focus on equitable access, accountability, academic freedom, institutional autonomy, and social responsibility. These are some core foundations for any solid tertiary education system, and we want to keep our eyes on those even as we deal with sort of the more technical elements of interventions in the COVID environment. And I will stop here, Dr. Sohail.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Roberta. Very informative presentation. It's really, I can see from the types of questions that we're having that there is lots of engagement from the attendees. It's very eye-opener in terms of looking at the bigger picture, looking at the global picture of the system level assessment. I would say from my perspective, as we are the part of ethic that's responsible for the academic accreditation. There are lots of questions that we are considering. It's nice to know that it's an alignment of what global, the World Bank globally are thinking of and the OECD is thinking of. Mm-hmm. I will start with sharing some of the questions that have been listed, and it's an invitation to all the attendees, please, to send your questions through the chat box so that I can read them for Roberta. There's a question on, it's thank you for you, and he mentioned that unfortunately during the last few months, we have seen many people talking about technologies as the solution for missing learning because of the COVID pandemic. Quite the positive, technologies did not provide education because it's a means for a cause, and we messed up the priorities. I think what he's trying to say here is we shouldn't be shooting the messenger if the crisis education didn't work perfectly well because of technology. Technology is a mean. And his question is, he said here that learning centered around the magic of technology rather than a learner-centered education. What do you think of the main lines of policies that we ought to have as a mandate for a better adoption and adaptation of technologies into our education?
That's a fantastic question, and I completely agree with the questioner. It was that the immediate reaction was, let's just focus on technology and not about, do we know enough how students learn? We talk about this a lot, actually, especially with post-secondary students. Student development theory actually offers a lot to understand how this young adult learners, the 16 to 25-year-olds, how they learn, what they need to learn. And for sure, this focus on technology didn't take student development theory into account, right? There really was a lack of learning science behind the technology. There is now, so I think this is where I would see the intervention being most important, that learning science specialists, and you have those people who make researching, understanding how students learn, working with the technology specialists, and coming up with delivery modes, because that will differ in every country, and it will differ based on capacity of the students and of the teachers. It is about training teachers, it's preparing academic faculty, but all of this being learning oriented, learner centered is exactly right. How can we make sure that at the core of all of this is the student and what they need? One of the things we've talked about in the lower income countries is that when there is no technology, you cannot say that there's going to be an iPad or a laptop that's connected to a satellite or Wi-Fi. What can you do to provide continued learning for that student? And it can be something as rudimentary as mailing them printed out packets of information. It's about getting them maybe a flash drive that they can attach to, a not connected technology, right? There's the stages of technology that we know exist, from CD-ROMs all the way through to our most high-tech laptop. Every element of that needs to be taken into account to meet the student where the student is, not to where the institution is, or not to where the largest piece of jargon is. And I think for sure that's what started. What started was, let's get everybody online. And very quickly, the equity implications of that and the learning implications of that emerged almost immediately. So that in some countries like the Philippines, they just said, forget it. We're not going to, the student said this, we're not going to accept online delivery because it's inequitable, and nobody knows if we'll learn anything. And that's not incorrect. I mean, it did have a negative impact on those who could have benefited, but it stopped that gap from those who could benefit and those who weren't going to benefit from getting bigger. So it is about the learning scientists and the technological ed tech people spending all their time together to understand better how to deliver to the needs of the students in that environment.
Yeah, if you may allow me, Roberta, I think some of the countries like Australia, for example, they have their quality assurance system for the tertiary education. They treat all the programs as the same, whether it's face-to-face or a distance education or an e-learning programs. These are just different methods or tools of delivering the programs, but the quality assurance agency is just one entity, regardless of the venue of delivering these educational. So I think this is in alignment of what you're saying, and there are a couple of other international agencies are with this alignment. Thanks for that answer. There are a couple of questions around the fairness of assessment utilizing online platforms. It came with the different styles of questions, but it all are centered around the fairness of assessment and on what should we do with that? Should we stop assessing people, like the example you just mentioned, or should we? Different countries have played with that differently. So your opinion on that?
Yes. Well, and I know you all just went through this massive assessment exercise, right? So you'll have a lot of data on how well it captures all of the issues that you wish to see captured through your exams, right? Because I suspect what you would see, maybe not in Saudi because you can guarantee certain levels of technological connectivity, maybe more than in other countries. But the equity issue with assessment is massive, and it's worse and worse in countries that have fewer and fewer resources. So you'd see, like in the United Kingdom, they didn't offer their big assessment exams. There are no G levels this year, or A levels will be postponed. And part of that is because of this, they can't ensure that those who have less access, not just to the exam itself, but to the preparation for the exam, would be treated fairly in the exam. And so through using teacher assessments instead of the exams to help with the college admission this year. I think there are massive questions about the fairness of assessments. My daughter took her AP exam, her advanced placement exam for an American school online this year. And, because we have decent, although you wouldn't know it from this presentation, we have decent Wi-Fi in my house. She didn't have any problems, but this wouldn't be the case with every student. So how accurate the assessments are, based on the challenges that technology provides, that's something that will have to be researched quite heavily. This is going to be a very data intensive period right now, where what you'd expect to see in your outcomes, how well are those reflected in the actual outcomes that you get? You will have a massive data set that will help you understand that, because you have some predictive benefits of having offered this exam before. You would have a sense of how it should shake out. Would it shake out the same way with online delivery? If so, maybe there's something to be said about the process you use, the preparation that was provided that can be replicated to scale elsewhere outside of your context. We will be looking globally for those examples. I know initially a country like Kenya said they were going to continue with their assessments, and then very quickly said, no, we're not going to, because it will not represent student outcomes fairly, because so many students have stopped learning. It's not fair to that student who was on track to do great and had this shock happen, that then their whole life would be impacted by a lack of preparation time that's happening to them right now. So it is the question for these high stakes exams. In some smaller contexts, it can be managed. In more technologically savvy countries, that can be managed. Scale matters a lot. If it's 300 million people country, or if it's 50 million, that's going to matter a lot, depending on how the outreach goes. But today, I think the question of high stakes exams is probably one of the more painful ones. There is a blog that just went up on the World Bank's website at the end of last week. I can send it to you all so you can find the link, asking exactly this question. No good answers, because we don't know yet how big the impact's going to be. But we can surmise they're going to be quite strong, because of the lack of learning and the lack of preparation, the inequality of all of this in the stages before the assessment.
Excellent, thank you. I mean, this is how educational research work, basically.
Exactly.
You have different countries who have implemented different philosophy and different plans. Like, for example, the Philippines, you mentioned, they just shut down all the online. So that's one practice. So practices differ from country to country with the different context. So I totally agree with what you're saying. And yeah, definitely, regarding the experience that Saudi Arabia and Qiyas and the ETIC has done with our online national exam, that would be a great opportunity for ETIC to share the scientific world with these findings. There are a couple of questions as well on how would this post-COVID, what we call it the new normal, how would a quality assurance agency function in the new normal? Thanks for the attendee who asked this, because I wanted to ask this question. We had pre-COVID some changes in it to be more market oriented. Academia always has its own autonomy, but to be that linked to the market, focusing on return of investment, focusing on the economic impact and the employability, whether with the quality assurance or with the university ranking system that we'll be releasing soon, we are focusing on all of these different areas. How do you envision quality assurance agency functioning in the post-COVID or the new normal era?
Sure. So I see actually quality assurance agencies and rankings to be very different things, right? The quality assurance is really establishing foundations. You know, if you've achieved quality assurance recognition in whatever form it is, programmatic, accreditation, institutional accreditation, that there's some baseline that's been met. Rankings is going another way. It's trying to establish sort of a hierarchy, right? So they do separate things. It'll be easier for quality assurance to adapt in the new normal space than I think it will be the rankings, because again, the methodology for the rankings will have to shift. But the quality assurance space is something, and as you said, Dr. Sohail, what you'll be able to figure is to look at a country like Australia, which is already doing these sort of robust multi-sectoral quality assessments based on delivery models. There's some schools like Arizona State University, which within one institution has a very traditional college plus this global remote delivery that they do. And those are achieving accreditation and having standards that are up to the foundation, right? We can't say, because it's not the job of quality assurance to say they are the best in the world. It's meant to say these are the classifications that they must achieve in the delivery of certain things. And yes, they do that. Super. You can assess the instructor quality, you can assess the curricula, you can assess the access to online resources in the same way that you would do with books in a library or other forms of learning material delivery, things like that. The methodology exists to have multi-sectoral quality assurance. It will be how to, at your national levels, or even in America, it would be like the state level. Germany's the same at the little or Switzerland at the cantonal level. What do you demand from your institutions at the baseline? And are they delivering that through multiple modes of delivery? You would maybe have to adapt the academic staff assessments to make sure that they include training in online delivery, for instance, right? That for sure that your academic staff are required to do professional development for remote delivery a certain number of hours. But that's not unusual. There's those kinds of accommodations are made by quality assurance agencies all the time. What will have to happen outside of quality assurance is that your laws will have to change. The laws that underpin your quality assurance environments, those are quite robust laws that are embedded in larger higher education laws usually. And those you'd have to have bylaws or entirely new laws that allow for online delivery. And then the last point of quality assurance, which would be maybe outside of the question, but I'm not entirely sure, is international delivery. So if someone is taking Coursera courses or an Oxford University online course, how can that course be accredited to a local degree program? That's new, maybe for a lot of countries. For others, it's not. Degree recognition or degree credit mobility is very much part of the Bologna process. And so the more you have an open relationship with other providers, the easier that is. But it would be about, again, adapting your charters to have space for mobility of credits and degrees. The models do exist, and you who do it professionally will not have a problem finding one that suits your environment, but it does require sort of rejiggering the charters and the regulatory environment around your quality assurance.
Excellent. Thanks, Roberta. There are a couple of questions related around universities or higher education autonomy, and fulfilling the national and international requirements. So I would read one of them as described by Bernstein and Sarah. Universities operate in accordance with the dual and often competing mission, which arise out of the conflicting ideas about whether higher education is a public or a private good. How does this affect the ways in which higher education institutions operate during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Excellent question. This is a great group. I feel like I'm teaching my class. I love it. This is great. Two different questions, really. This question about university autonomy, that is a legislative question, right? The one that sort of sits in, not every institution exists in an autonomous way. We believe it should. but it is very much dependent on the financial relationship or governance relationship with the national government in which they operate. This question of public or private goods, some of it is really embedded in historic norms. You know, how old are your systems and how strong do they feel anchored into their society? Newer institutions tend to have less underpinning in the public good. They're much more about private provision, and private outcomes, which is why, not provision, but outcomes, which is why this question that Dr. Sahel, you asked about employment outcomes, you know, how much is quality assurance going to focus on this economic viability of graduates? When it focuses on that, it's a private good almost entirely. So that tension becomes much more about how can you base your understanding of even the private good as a public good. You know, more high earning graduates is good for society, which is why we talk about both in our space. In Latin America, it's actually quite the opposite. In Latin America, higher education, post-secondary education is seen very strongly as a public good. It's guaranteed as a constitutional right to students. It's provided free across most of the countries of Latin America for the same reason. The constitutions at independence from the colonial powers often embedded higher education as something that is a right. Once it's a public right and a public good, then it's a different conversation, which makes it much harder during times of fiscal constraints to say, okay, we then will have to decrease enrollment perhaps because we don't have the money to keep enrollments wide and still provide it for free. And you know, the tensions then change between access potentially in a time of fiscal constraints versus private payments, private tuition. And countries across Latin America have wrestled with this. Chile and Colombia in particular have done really robust reforms to try to reconcile these historic tensions with current practicalities. You know, we actually feel very strongly that public and private benefits from tertiary education are in balance and are both equally important to countries. And so when I come in, and I often have to come in and talk to ministers of finance or ministers of education differently, because a minister of finance cares much more about the economic returns of this, and a minister of education may be more diverse in the thinking about, you know, what is an educated person? How does an educated person contribute to society economically, socially, politically? You as your institutional leaders or your academic thought leaders on the ground have a huge role to play in this, because you're educating those students to understand what they are to their societies. Are they a public good? Is it just about their own personal private return? That's the job that all of you play and execute with each of your students. If the narrative is around this graduation, you as an individual are going to make your country better, or part of this robust space, they'll see themselves as a public good as well as a private good, right? As they themselves are getting private returns, but they contribute to a very robust society. Scandinavia is the best example of a space where each individual student sees both of those things quite clearly. The United States maybe focuses much more on the private returns, where I came from, but we spend a lot more money for our educations too. So there's some of that as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Roberta. There are a couple of more questions, but I know that you have another.
I can stay on for like 10 more minutes. I can stay on for 10 more minutes.
Okay. Excellent. So a couple of more questions. This one was related to the governance. You know, you mentioned about the governance in your presentation. The question was how to balance between academic autonomy and fulfilling the national trends on hand and the international needs, or the international needs and demand on the other hand. There is always that challenge between, you know, academia has its own, you know, historical, autonomy and freedom, and there is always that call towards being, you know, market sensitive and being responsive to the market and, adapting what's the market. Is it really, do we want academia to be autonomous and focus on research, or do we want academia to be producing? I know that you're talking about tertiary education and that spans, universities and others, but this challenge is a bit challenging, the difference between them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, you went exactly where I would go with my answer to this question, which is the focus on diversification of the system actually allows for autonomy in multiple structures, right? And the problem is when the system is very top heavy, so that it's all high-end research institutions. And then there's little or nothing that sits in just the teacher-driven or skills-oriented or competency-based learning, which all should exist in a sort of a well-articulated sector, because not every student wants a research-driven, theoretically driven education post-secondary, right? Some of them really do want to just go out and get a good job, and that good job requires certain skills, and those skills are provided in post-secondary education. Other students are looking towards getting a PhD and becoming a thought leader or a scientific leader, or just a high-end, highly skilled worker. A good system allows for all of those things, and then each institution on its own can, with a clear mission, run autonomously. And I think that's really the power of a strong governance environment, that the legislative environment is in place that allows for diversified institutional types, that the Ministry of Education, the Prime Minister's office, wherever your power lies in the the education space where you operate, really has a vision for this multitude of institutional structures. Then they each are required to have a charter and a mission that's very specific to what they contribute. And then within that, once that's in place, their financing is solid enough, they're of good quality, they can operate autonomously because they have a completely specific identity. The challenge is in these sectors, and those do exist, all of you know them, where there's just one model and it's one thing, and they're supposed to all be horizontal, right? They're all the same. Then it becomes very difficult to actually say we value this over this, or how can you offer something else. Being different, being market driven becomes a tension point instead of being a benefit from the sector. Market driven can be fine if you have all these different opportunities being provided, because then the student can go where they find the best fit. But many countries don't offer that, and then it's really just a lot of the same. And I think that's going to be something that the 21st century takes away from sectors. I think that the evolution of tertiary education in the next 75 years or so is going to be one of clear mission identity and a place in the marketplace that is very diversified.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks, Roberta. There is a question on the impact of, we always talk about the internationalization strategy and the globalization. The balance, that question is the balance or the impact on nationalization programs and building the national capacity, and the internationalization of the globalization trend. So how can universities and higher education system make that fine balance between these two directions?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think this is a question that's becoming increasingly important right now, because there is this real pain that's coming into global higher education, that the global space doesn't exist right now. And for those of us who work in this global environment, we see this, the community of higher education being global. It's quite painful to see the restrictions happening. I think that there's multiple layers of internationalization, and I know I'm speaking to a lot of people who know this as well, or if not better than I do, but where internationalization can be everything from spending a portion of your career living abroad, to having international examples as part of the curriculum being taught in the classroom, right? When you talk about literature, or symbolism in literature, that you offer examples of literature from around the world, not just from the context in which you live and exist, right? Internationalization is all of those things. It's multiculturalism. It's a recognition of the other in your day-to-day work. And that's something that no matter how strong the national space is, it can still be offered. There's a lot to be offered by looking internationally for your curricular evolution. But in the next sort of the current COVID crisis, it is about, can you actually have joint programs, even if you just offer a course that shares Zoom space with a campus in China, that you're actually sitting in the same classroom with international students via Zoom. That at least gives exposure to those of a different culture. And for those of us who know the huge benefit of that, of the other being the same instead of the other being scary. That's an incredibly important, delivery element of internationalization. So we need to find creative ways to do that. And then the nationalist question, I think somebody was asking this question about, if we see increased nationalization, which is isolation from the global space, and some academic staff may be fine with that. And so, it's up to the either quality assurance agencies or ministries of education, whoever sees internationalization as important, to keep injecting it in ways that are negotiated and finessed, but also inclusive, give students a chance, if they want it, to find internationalization in their education. Any sector that's well diversified can have a place for any student and what they want to achieve. I think for countries that look, though, to have their students prepared for the global marketplace, prepared to compete for global research funding, and all of the things that do require an international perspective, it's really important to find new avenues for that. And that will happen through remote delivery in the short term. And then when, if we're not flying extensively until there's a vaccine for COVID, it's going to be remotely for the long term. But we can all be creative about that, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Roberta. I will conclude with this. It's not a question, it's a comment from two attendees. They're basically talking about, the business model. This pandemic should, that's what he's writing or she's writing. I think that there should be new model of governance and partnership and collaboration between universities and other community institutions. And as well, he's mentioning that this should impact, there should be a new business model to ensure the financial sustainability of these institutions. So the financial aspect with the governance aspect, with the business model aspect, with the collaboration aspect. So I think not working in silos, all of these different institutions at the national level should think, together in solving these problems.
I think that's right. And I remember when I was working, I had just started working with Jamil Salmi in 2009 after the 2008 global recession. And we had extensive conversations even at that time about how can we innovate in the time of crisis. And I think this is right. I think this is the healthiest mindset that one could have in a crisis, is to say, maybe this is an opportunity to think about things differently. We were getting quite fixed about, in certain country contexts, about how one pays for higher education, or who gets to receive it, how it's delivered. The conversation about MOOCs, which emerged maybe 8 or 9 years ago, none of us believed MOOCs were going to be the main delivery model because it was too removed from the student. This has been actually an interesting correction, because it allows for localized remote delivery, localized content, right? It allows each institution to think more about delivering outside of the traditional. It's the same with how you finance it. One of the things we support, I have a whole different presentation on higher education financing, and it is about being more performance driven, or being tying financing to national strategies in some ways, so that there is more specificity to what is sought by the financing of higher education, that everything else can be found maybe through donors or something else if it doesn't suit what the purpose of the institution is or what the goals are. And those are negotiated between institutions and funders so that there is still some autonomy there. But I completely agree that the best outcome from this circumstance would be some innovative thinking and some transformational change that's driven by the sector as it learns and adapts through these processes. And financing and governance, quality assurance, as ever, are the 3 pillars that will be incredibly important to supporting the structures as they adapt to the post-COVID world.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Roberta, for your time. I know we took 15 minutes extra of your time, and it's been an amazing learning experience for me, and it's an eye opener looking at the global perspective of the higher education systems. And I will just revise, rereading your bio, and it's very interesting that you wrote a piece on the forefront of international higher education in honor of Philip Altbach, Prof. Altbach is with us as an advisor in our. It's a small world. It's a small world.
He's my dissertation advisor. Yes.
He's an advisor with us in finalizing our ranking system for the higher education institutions. So we will have these two complementary functions, the quality assurance and the ranking. I was just smiling when I was reading his face, his name. It's a small world. Yeah, he is. Roberta, thank you so much. It was very informative, very thought-provoking, and very fresh look at the higher education system or the tertiary education system around the world. And thank you really for the 200 attendees who stayed with us for an hour and 15 minutes, and their active engagement and very deep questions and very strategic questions. Really thanks to them, and thanks to His Excellency, the President of ETIC, for his support for all of these kinds of webinars with the World Bank, to Dr. Nayaf Al-Jabri, the Director of the Research Administration, where basically they are our point of contact with the World Bank, with the OECD, and all the team working with him. The IT, there are tons of people behind this webinar to make these webinars a success on every 2 weeks basis. So huge thanks to them. And we're hoping, Roberta, to see you in the. You leaked one of your presentation, the higher education finance presentation. So we were hoping that we will have you one more time or a couple more times on different aspects of higher education. It's been truly an honor to have you, and a very warming and very fresh presentation, very engaging online webinar presenter. If you have a final conclusion remarks, Roberta, before we conclude this webinar.
Well, I just wish to thank you, Dr. Sahel, for your great facilitation and your friendly welcome and support. These cannot, they're not always easy. This one felt easy and really interactive. So also thank the participants for sticking with us and for offering their comments. And just know for sure, I will join back on any topic you want related to tertiary education. It'd be a pleasure to work with you again in the future.
Sure.
So thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good day. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.